The candlelight flickered against the stone walls, casting long shadows that danced like spirits in the darkness. He was once a king, a ruler, a man adored, feared, followed. But now, he was a corpse waiting to die. His breath came in wet, uneven gasps. His skin, once smooth and regal, was now flaking in layers, blackened by infection. His nose had collapsed. His mouth hung open, swollen, leaking. His eyes darted wildly, not at people, but at ghosts no one else could see. On his silk sheets, stained brown and yellow with fluids, the once great monarch clawed at his own chest, begging for a mercy that would never come. "Make them stop," whispering, he screamed. "Please God, no more spiders." But there were no spiders. There was no one whispering. Only servants who stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze. Not because of fear, but because of what he had become. This is what syphilis did to kings. It didn't strike like a sword in battle. It crept in, quiet as poison. It bloomed in their blood, curled itself around their spine, devoured their brains from within, and turned emperors into madmen. For years, these rulers sat on thrones, wore gold crowns, kissed the hands of popes and queens, all while this silent disease brewed underneath their skin. At first, it was nothing. A sore, a rash, a bit of discomfort. But syphilis waits. It does not strike fast. It waits until the right moment, and then it begins to take everything. Their bodies twisted. Their minds betrayed them. Some went blind. Some forgot who they were. Some ordered the execution of their own sons. Others believed God had cursed them, and maybe he had imagined a king with jewels on his fingers, unable to hold a spoon because his nerves had shattered. Imagine an emperor hiding in a castle, convinced that the portraits on his walls were laughing at him. Imagine a prince so decayed from the inside that his own mother locked the palace doors and left him to die alone. This wasn't just a disease. It was a mirror held up to the face of power, showing the rotting truth underneath the crown. And it wasn't rare. Syphilis moved through royal blood like wildfire, passed through secret affairs, political marriages, and even from mother to unborn child. Behind the grand portraits and embroidered coats were bodies eaten alive from the inside. And the worst part? They couldn't speak of it. To admit illness was to admit weakness. To speak of syphilis, a disease of the flesh, was to admit sin. So they smiled in public and screamed in private. The king who ordered wars was now crying in the dark, hallucinating snakes crawling up his legs. The queen who once ruled over nations now drooled into her pillow, unable to recognize her own reflection. In this story, we will walk through candlelit halls. We will listen at the doors of broken kings. We will hear their final screams, feel their panic, witness their isolation. You will see glory at its peak, and then you will watch it rot. These are the top 5 royals who suffered from syphilis. Their stories are not just history. They are warnings, because even the most powerful men in the world could not escape what came for them in the night. In the bitter cold heart of Russia, under skies heavy with snow and silence, a child was born into destiny, or perhaps into doom. His name was Ivan IV, the son of Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow and the Grand Princess Elena Glinskaya. But he would not just inherit a crown. He would reshape an empire. He entered the world in 1530, under the weight of prophecy. Some believed he was chosen by God. Others whispered he was marked by demons. But no one could deny he was different. Even as a boy, when Ivan was just 3 years old, his father died, and the Russian throne, still young and vulnerable, became a battlefield, not of soldiers, but of boyars, the powerful nobles who ruled behind the scenes. Little Ivan was left alone in a palace of wolves. His mother tried to hold the court together, but she was poisoned when Ivan was just 8. And so the future Tsar grew up in shadows. He watched men lie, cheat, and murder, all in the name of power. He saw courtiers bow by day and stab each other by night. And in the middle of it all stood a small boy, cold, hungry, angry, and learning. From behind heavy doors, Ivan saw servants beaten. He saw people vanish without reason. No love, no safety, only survival. It twisted something inside him, something that would never fully untwist again. But even then, there was brilliance in him. By the time he was 10, Even read ancient texts in Latin and Greek. He studied the histories of Rome and Byzantium. He memorized prayers and poems. He asked questions about God, fate, and power. He wanted to rule, but not as a prince. He wanted to become something Russia had never seen before. A true emperor, a Tsar. At 16 years old, the boy who once lived in terror walked into the cathedral of the Dormition in Moscow. There, in front of the people, he placed a crown on his own head. Not just any crown, but the Monomax cap, symbol of divine authority. And in that moment, Ivan IV declared himself the first Tsar of all Russia. The people roared. The church blessed him. And for a moment, the cold world seemed to warm. He ruled with vision. He reformed the army, the church, the state, built roads, courts, and libraries. He married a noble woman named Anastasia Romanovna, who was said to be gentle, wise, and deeply in love with him. Under his early rule, Russia expanded and stabilized, defeated enemies on the battlefield. He inspired loyalty among the common people. He spoke with fire, punished injustice, and called himself a servant of God. He was fierce. He was fair. People feared him. They also adored him. He wrote religious sermons, composed music. He studied medicine. His court was filled with scholars and philosophers. Travelers from Europe wrote home in wonder, describing the golden spires of Moscow and the strange, brilliant Tsar who ruled from within. Deep down, the boy who had once watched his mother die was still there, waiting. And he had not forgotten. Still, as the 1550s began, Russia had never been stronger. Ivan marched into battle with confidence, leading campaigns against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and he won. He tore down his enemies like a storm. His armies brought back silver, silk, spices, and thousands of prisoners. He was not just a king anymore. He was a legend. People called him Ivan Grozny. In English, that's often translated as Ivan the Terrible. In Old Russian, Grozny means more than terrible. It means formidable, awe-inspiring, thunderous. It's what Ivan was in those early years, a force of nature. His court shone with riches. His people sang his name. His enemies feared even the rumor of his approach. And yet, even in triumph, something stirred beneath his skin. His health grew worse. He suffered from sudden fevers, rages. He began to hear things no one else could hear. He accused his advisors of betrayal. He questioned God's silence. Most of all, he clung to his wife, Anastasia. She was his anchor, his reason, his light. In private letters, he called her his angel. With her by his side, he held on to the part of himself that still believed in goodness. Fate, as always, was waiting. In 1560, Anastasia fell sick. First, it seemed like a simple illness, a fever, a weakness. She did not get better. Her hair began to fall out. Her skin turned gray. Eyes lost their shine. She withered, slowly. Till one morning she didn't wake up. The court wept. Church prayed, and even broke. Believed she had been poisoned, and maybe she had. Turned on the nobles. Tortured suspects. He burned villages. Shaved his head and wore black. He screamed in his palace at night, calling for her. Return. Cursed God. Tsar who had once built Russia into an empire was slipping, just from grief, from something deeper. Something inside his body, something inside his blood. Some historians now believe that this was the moment his syphilis began to bloom. In the years before, Ivan had taken mistresses. There were whispers of affairs, of strange rashes, of secret treatments using mercury. Had visited foreign women during campaigns. Doctors spoke in quiet tones of the French disease, we now call syphilis, making its way through the Russian court. No one dared say it aloud. How could a man like Ivan be infected? Could a man chosen by God suffer from a disease of the flesh? He did. Slowly, it began to show. Not yet. Fully, not now. A little while longer, Ivan held on to glory. Still sat on the throne. Still commanded armies. Still wrote poems and laws. Myths of his greatness still held strong. Like a crack in the ice, the fracture had begun. And beneath that crack, madness was waiting. Death of Anastasia was more than a tragedy. It was a curse breaking loose. Great Tsar of Russia did not simply mourn his wife. He unraveled, screamed so loudly the palace guards claimed they heard it from the courtyard, smashed icons, accused the heavens, shouted that he'd been murdered, not by disease, but at the hands of traitors in his court. At first, people thought it was grief, a broken man lost in love, but soon came something else. He withdrew from the Kremlin, locking himself in distant fortresses, refused food, refused warmth, slept on stone floors wrapped in rough wool. Advisors came begging orders, but he sent them away. Sometimes he wouldn't speak for days. Other times he wrote endless letters filled with visions of fire, blood, and punishment. And one morning, he vanished. Alice was silent. The throne was empty. People panicked. The Tsar had been kidnapped. Had he gone mad, or worse, was he dead? Weeks passed. Came the letter. From a hidden monastery, Ivan wrote to the church and the nobles. In it, he declared that he was abdicating the throne, that the betrayal at court had poisoned his soul, that Russia was no longer worthy of him. Panic exploded. Without Ivan there would be chaos. Foreign powers would invade. Civil war would begin. And so, the nobles who once whispered against him now came crawling. They begged him to return, promised him absolute authority, promised to hand over his enemies, and even agreed, but with one condition: that he would return, not as a Tsar of mercy, but as the hand of divine punishment. Thus began one of the most horrifying chapters in Russian history, the creation of the Oprichnia. It was a state within a state, a shadow kingdom, a brutal reign of terror designed by Ivan himself. He built a personal guard, black-robed men on black horses, armed not with banners, but with brooms and dog heads tied to their saddles. The dog heads were symbols to sniff out traitors. The brooms were for sweeping away the filth. They rode through cities like reapers. They tortured, burned, dismembered, and drowned. Whole villages vanished. Nobles were boiled alive. Monks were sewn into bear skins and hunted. Mothers watched sons be executed. Priests were flayed in public squares. And Ivan watched it all. Sometimes he joined. Sometimes he ordered. Sometimes he laughed. Something had changed inside him. Something that went beyond grief. His letters became darker, more frantic. He saw devils in the eyes of his advisors. He believed birds were whispering secrets. He accused women of casting spells. He saw betrayal everywhere and mercy nowhere. And his body was changing too. The physicians were silent, but the symptoms were growing. Boils on the skin, hair falling out, sudden rages, mood swings, twitching hands, pain in his legs, rashes, night sweats, hallucinations. He claimed to see Anastasia at night. He said her ghost came to him, not to comfort, but to warn. He was being eaten from the inside, she told him. And she was right, though the word was never spoken out loud. Many modern historians agree. Ivan was showing signs of late-stage syphilis. In those years, the disease was untreatable. Only mercury was used, which often made things worse. And kings, especially kings like Ivan, would never admit they had contracted something so shameful. A disease of prostitutes, a punishment from God. But the signs were everywhere. Ivan's skin was said to rot in patches. His gums bled. His spine bent forward. His nose became misshapen. His moods turned sharper, crueler, more explosive. He would cry 1 hour and kill the next. He married again, then again. Each time, the wives became paler, sicker, more silent. Some were sent to convents. Others died mysteriously. He beat them, abused them. He believed they were poisoning him, even as his own body collapsed under disease. And yet, the throne remained his. Because despite the madness, the terror, the rot, Ivan was still feared, still obeyed, still seen by many as a God-chosen ruler. And for a while, that myth held together, until one day, it shattered. It began with a name, Novgorod. One of Russia's oldest cities, wealthy, proud, independent. Ivan believed the people there were planning to betray him, to align with Poland and destroy him from within. There was no proof, only whispers. But for Ivan, whispers were enough. And so he rode to Novgorod. What followed was a massacre. His men sealed the city gates. Then came the arrests, the burnings, the drownings. Over 60,000 people were killed in just 5 weeks. Men, women, children, hung from city walls, tossed into frozen rivers, boiled alive in their homes. Churches were set on fire with people still inside. And through it all, Avon watched from his sleigh, laughing, praying, singing hymns. This was not war, it was madness. And it was spreading. In the months that followed, his paranoia deepened. He believed his enemies lived in every room. His body spasmed without warning. His teeth cracked from grinding. He wore heavy furs even in summer. He began hitting his servants, then his friends, then his family. One day, his pregnant daughter-in-law came to court wearing something he didn't approve of. Even screamed at her, accused her of shame. Then, in a fit of rage, he beat her in the stomach so brutally, the baby died inside her. When his son, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him, Ivan struck his own son in the skull with a scepter, cracked his head open, watched him bleed and die. That was his heir, his pride, his only hope. And he killed him with his own hands. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by his son's corpse weeping, kissing his feet, begging for forgiveness. But it was too late. The crown had finally devoured the man, and the disease had devoured the rest. He was now a ghost, his body failing, his soul tormented, his legacy soaked in blood. But still, he ruled. And Russia, for better or worse, still called him Tsar. The throne that once stood for glory had become a coffin in waiting. Ivan IV, the Tsar of all Russia, the man who once struck terror into entire kingdoms, was now a shriveled, twisted, moaning shell of what he had been. His skin peeled in layers, yellow and gray, like rotting parchment. His fingers were bent, backwards with disease, curled into claws. His spine had collapsed inward. He could no longer walk without help. The robes that once shimmered with gold and fur now hung limp on a hunched figure that barely resembled a man, much less a king. The smell was unbearable. Servants who approached him covered their faces with linen, not from respect, but from rot. The stench of decaying flesh clung to him like a fog. His gums bled constantly, staining his teeth red. His breath, when he spoke, came in wheezes, thick with mucus and phlegm. And when he coughed, pieces of tissue sometimes came out. It wasn't just the body. The mind, oh, the mind had gone somewhere far darker. He heard voices. Day and night. In the stone halls of the Kremlin, he would shout at empty walls. He argued with shadows. He sobbed at the foot of portraits. "Why are you laughing?" He would scream. "I gave you everything." He believed the dead had come back to haunt him. Sometimes he ordered his guards to search the floorboards, claiming there were worms, devils, or assassins hiding inside the walls. There was no one there. But Ivan couldn't see that anymore. His physicians, trembling, tried to treat him with mercury, rubbed into his gums, burned into his skin. They gave him tonics made from herbs and crushed beetles. They bled him, fed him opium. Nothing worked. He became violent, uncontrollable. One court doctor tried to leave the palace and was never seen again. Ivan didn't sleep. He wandered halls at night, barefoot, muttering prayers, dragging a cane carved with skulls. He would slap servants awake and demand to know what day it was, what year. He sometimes forgot his own name. Other times he believed he was still a boy, still in the palace with his mother, still afraid of being poisoned. And sometimes he would forget his son was dead. He would call for him, leave seats empty at his table. Once, he tried to give a command to the corpse, weeping as he spoke. Grief never left him. It had simply become madness. He had no true allies now. His old guard, the oprichniki, the black-robed killers, were disbanded. Many were executed. The boyars, the nobles, only stayed close out of fear. His later wives were terrified to speak. He had lost children, lost ministers, lost control. He was completely alone, surrounded by hundreds, and the fear that once defined him, that once gave him control, had turned inward. He now feared his own court, his own meals. He stopped eating with others, terrified that the bread was poisoned. He drank wine only if it came directly from a monk. Even then, he often made the monk drink it first. Paranoia consumed everything. He had the floors of his room covered in straw, so no one could hear him walk. He refused to bathe with water from public wells. Believed foreign ambassadors, plotting to kidnap him. At one point, he wore armor to bed. At another, he stopped speaking entirely for several days, only staring at the ceiling, eyes wide, breathing like a man on the edge of drowning. And all the while, the disease inside him was eating everything. Syphilis, left untreated, becomes a monster. His nerves began to die. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His legs swelled with sores. His genitals became ulcerated. He would scream in pain trying to urinate. His bones cracked in cold weather. His joints locked at strange angles. The hallucinations grew worse. He claimed to see Anastasia standing at the foot of his bed, not as she was, bloated, with worms crawling from her mouth. He said their murdered son came to him at night, dripping with blood, holding his cracked skull in both hands. He saw angels in the rafters, heard horses galloping through his walls. The palace had become a haunted house, and even was its prisoner. Sometimes, he'd throw feasts in the middle of the night, grand banquets with golden music and entire tables of food. No one touched the food, because when he grew bored or angry, he'd accuse the guests of treason and have them dragged away mid-meal, screaming, begging, never returning. One servant wrote that the sound of laughter had become a death sentence. He no longer ruled, he tormented. The empire, once so feared, had grown exhausted. Wars were lost. Land was squandered. Trade collapsed. Foreign kings mocked Russia, saying its emperor was a ghost with a crown. Diplomats came and saw the Tsar, hunched, rotting, spinning in madness, and returned home with tales of horror. Described his black robes, his wild, greasy hair, bleeding mouth, childlike tantrums. He'd become a monster in legend, and worse in reality. But even still believed in his divine right, still believed he was chosen by God. In his mind, he was not dying. He was being tested. He was being purified by suffering. And that belief, that terrifying holy fire, never left him. Near the end, he rarely left his chambers. He became too weak to climb stairs. He kept himself surrounded by relics, bones of saints, dried flowers from old battles, pieces of his dead wife's clothing. He wore a cloak stitched with verses from the Bible, as if words could keep him whole, but nothing could stop what was coming. His body began to swell. His skin turned dark and tight. His breath wheezed constantly. He couldn't sit for more than a few minutes without collapsing. Sometimes he passed out in the middle of meetings. Other times he screamed at the windows, begging for the sky to open. The last spark of the great Tsar had flickered into something almost unrecognizable. And still, no one dared speak of the disease. No one said syphilis. No one said madness. The church called it divine trial. The court called it age. The physician said it was exhaustion. But behind closed doors, they knew, and the servants knew, and the world would soon find out, because Ivan was not just dying, he was rotting, alive, in front of everyone. The room was quiet, too quiet for a palace once filled with screams. Heavy tapestries hung on the stone walls, dull with dust and mildew. Candles burned low in their holders. The shadows stretched long, cold, and still. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing Moscow in silence. Inside, the Tsar sat, motionless. Ivan Vasilievich, the terrible, the thunderer, the Tsar of all Russia, was staring at a chessboard. His robes were too big for his frame now. His skin, stretched thin across his face, was tinged green and purple. His eyes, those eyes that had once terrified nobles and foreign kings, were sunken, bloodshot, barely alive. Each breath sounded like the last. He had summoned a visitor, a man named Bogdan Belsky, a court official. They had played chess before, sometimes even liked to pretend things were still normal, that he could still plan, still control, still outmaneuver the world. But this was not a game. This was the end. As he lifted a piece, a bishop, some say, his hand began to tremble. His mouth opened slightly, and then he fell, collapsed, forward across the chessboard, a final move made not by strategy, but by death. The guards outside heard a thud. When they entered the room, they found him on the floor, twitching. His face was twisted in pain, his lips mumbling nonsense. And then his body went still and cold and began to leak. The Tsar was dead. But Russia did not rejoice that they waited. They stared, and they whispered, because his body, once powerful and golden in armor, now stank of infection. The rot, once hidden beneath layers of fur and ceremony, burst into the open. His legs were swollen, his hands blackened, his groin oozed blood and pus. The royal doctors dared not touch him with bare hands. He had become toxic, even in death. And yet, he had to be buried. Russia could not have a king rot on the throne. So they dressed him quickly, packed his body with herbs, sewed his mouth shut, wrapped him in cloth soaked in vinegar and holy water. But even still, the smell seeped through. They placed him in a coffin of cedar, hoping the wood would hold back the scent. It didn't. And as they carried him through the streets of Moscow, the people did not cheer, they did not cry. They stood in silence, covering their faces, bowing without feeling, because the man in that coffin was not a hero. Not anymore. He had built an empire and burned it. He had ruled like a god and died like a ghost. But the horror was not over. Strange things began to happen almost immediately. The bells of the Kremlin tower rang without being pulled. A storm rolled in, fast and violent. Lightning struck the cathedral dome. The moment the coffin passed beneath it, horses refused to move forward. Dogs howled through the night. Some say it was coincidence. Others believed it was even, not resting, but raging. In the days that followed, rumors spread like wildfire that he had cursed Russia before he died, that his spirit haunted the halls of the Kremlin, that his soul had been denied entry to heaven and was now trapped in the bell towers, screaming to be let in. And then came the dreams. Servants claimed they saw him in the halls, dripping wet, clutching his dead son in his arms. A cook swore he saw even at the end of his bed, playing chess with a headless monk. A priest said the candles on the altar flickered whenever his name was spoken. Even the terrible was gone, but he would not go quietly. Years later, when they opened his tomb to confirm his remains, the stench hit the workers so hard some vomited on the spot. The bones were black, the robes were half dissolved, and traces of mercury and arsenic were still present in the remains, an echo of the poisonous cures that had once scorched his blood. Modern forensic teams studied the bones centuries later. Their conclusion? Ivan's skeleton showed signs of extreme syphilitic damage. His joints were eroded. His skull showed lesions. His spine was deformed. His bones carried the unmistakable signature of a man who had suffered long and terribly, and in silence. He had tried to hide it, but his body told the truth. And then came the ultimate irony. The heir he murdered, Ivan Ivanovich, would have made a strong ruler, wise, respected, loved. With him gone, the crown passed to Fyodor, a sickly, passive son, unable to govern. Under Fyodor's reign, Russia spiraled into what became known as the Time of Troubles, a period of famine, civil war, invasion, and chaos. The man who had claimed to save Russia had, in fact, damned it. So his legacy became a paradox. Was he a visionary or a villain? A holy protector or a mad butcher? A builder of nations or the architect of ruin? History still debates it, but one thing is certain. Even the fourth, the terrible, the mighty Tsar who saw himself as God's chosen, was not defeated by an enemy army, not slain in battle, but toppled by a revolution, was destroyed by his own blood. By a disease whispered in royal corridors, hidden behind silk and crown. Syphilis. It gnawed at him in silence for years, poisoned his mind, infected his choices. It broke his body, made him a king who killed his son, terrorized his people, lost himself completely, died with a crown on his head. He was already rotting long before he hit the floor. And in the end, left behind no legacy of peace, only the echo of screams. In the great halls of history, power leaves behind many shapes. Some rulers are remembered for their wisdom, others for their cruelty, some for their glory in battle, others for the peace they preserved. Even the fourth is remembered for something far more human and far more haunting. He wanted to be more than a man, more than a ruler, wanted to become eternal, carved into the memory of his people, thunderous like a god, immortal like scripture. In the end, he became a warning, not a legend. Ghost. The tragedy of Ivan the Terrible is not that he died. How? Died. Not in battle, not surrounded by loved ones, alone, twisted in pain, hallucinating the faces of people he had destroyed. Man who had once unified a vast and brutal land, reduced to a trembling creature whispering to shadows in candlelight. That, the great lie of power. At last, history has shown, again and again, no crown is heavy enough to protect a man from the truths of the body. No empire large enough to silence the mind when it begins to betray its owner. No throne tall enough to escape the reach of disease, regret, and time. Even ruled with the belief that he was chosen by God, and perhaps he was. What he never understood was this: being chosen is not the same as being spared. You can build a kingdom with iron and fire, still fall to something as small as a bacterium. Disease that undid even did not care for his armies, not bow to his titles, crept in, slowly, secretly, killing a man who believed himself untouchable. Took years, even decades. Never stopped. It did what no assassin could. No rebellion dared. It rotted the king, the inside out. And in doing so, it revealed something timeless. The human body is the one empire we all rule, and all eventually lose. The mind, for all its brilliance, is fragile. Soul, no matter how righteous it believes itself to be, can fall into darkness. Heart can be guided by love, as it was when Ivan loved Anastasia, or swallowed by grief, as it was when she died. Came next was not destiny. It was choice. Slow drowning in the waters of fear, guilt, pain, pride. Historian Robert Payne once wrote, Ivan's life was a long series of confessions disguised as terror. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps his cruelty was a cry for mercy, twisted way to beg the world to understand his suffering. Betrayals, his paranoia, his illness, isolation. History does not reward pain with forgiveness, only with memory. And what we remember is not the child who studied Latin, or the young Tsar who dreamed of reform, or the husband who wept for his wife. Remember the man who killed his son, drowned his own people, turned Moscow into a graveyard. And yet, perhaps there is something to learn there too. As Ivan was not born a monster, he became one, slowly, quietly, with every choice, every secret, every act he told himself was justified. He was not evil at first, only afraid, and then proud, and then sick, and then by the time he looked back, it was too late. That is the final horror, not the death, not even the madness, but the fact that he might have been something else. Someone better. If he had mourned differently, ruled differently, loved longer, spoken more truthfully, or simply asked for help. But kings rarely ask for help, and power, once tasted, makes men forget they are mortal. Syphilis did not just destroy Ivan's body. It exposed the illusion. It showed that even the most terrifying ruler in history, the man who burned cities and crushed empires, could be broken by his own flesh, by his own blood, by his own mind. It showed that even kings rot. And in that truth, we see a reflection, not just of Ivan, but of all of us. We all carry within us a clock, a flaw, a secret we try to bury, a fear we try to ignore. And the longer it stays hidden, the louder it grows. Ivan's story in the end is not just rushes. It is not just about thrones or war or disease. It is about what happens when a man loses everything and cannot admit that he is falling. It is about the silence between screams, the darkness behind the crown, and it is a reminder that pride is no shield, that power does not save us, that no one, no matter how feared, how rich, how chosen, escapes the moment when their body fails, their voice cracks, and the truth comes crawling in. So remember him, not as a ruler, not even as a monster, but as a man who wanted to be God, and learned too late that he was only human.